Hello, everybody. This is Sharon Dittmar with the Mid-America region of the UUA, and welcome to our webinar, HR 101. I have with me today Rob Mola, who's the Director of HR, Human Relations or Resources at the Unitarian Universalist Association, and we are fortunate enough to have him here with us to give us some basic tips. Oh, and he's here with his dog. Who's your dog, Rob?
Yes, I am. I'm here with Pau and Xander. Pau and Xander, and they are being quite naughty at this moment in time. I apologize.
Oh no, it's all good. We're all sheltering in place. Best
Yes, we
wishes to
are.
them. So Rob, what do you have for us today?
So today I've got a presentation. I'm going to take you through a whole bunch of basics on HR and everything from the personnel file to how to access resources at the UUA. And so I'll walk you through pieces one by one. Are you ready for me to start?
I'm ready. We're ready.
Great. So let me share my screen. So I put together a little agenda for today. I'm going to walk you through the personnel file. I'll talk to you about hire letters, the I-9 forms. We'll talk about job descriptions. We'll talk about staffing for diversity in here as well. And I have a section on the policy manual because I think every organization needs a personnel manual for their staff. We'll talk about evaluation and assessment. This is the performance reviews that people fear so much. And then I've got some hints and tips for you at the end. So let's get started. If I can leave you with anything at the end of this webinar, is I want you to take away these two things. And the first one is find your labor attorney now. Every organization, every congregation needs their own labor attorney. You might not need to use them right now, but you should have somebody on retainer that you can call when a crisis hits. And I think this is important because when you find yourself in the midst of an employment issue, you oftentimes need answers pretty quickly, and you don't want to have to spend the time searching for a labor attorney who understands, first of all, finding a labor attorney who's got availability, finding a labor attorney who knows your state and local jurisdiction and the employment laws in your state and your local jurisdictions, and then who's also familiar with religious institutions and churches, because there are lots of labor laws that are particular to churches and religious institutions, and other laws that don't apply to us. So I think it's important to do your due diligence, do your homework now. If you don't have a labor attorney on retainer, start searching for one right now. I think it's really critical. When I was interviewing years ago, I've been at the association now for just about 13 years. My first question to my hire team when I was getting interviewed was, who's your labor attorney? I wanted to know that up front to make sure that we were prepared. And as I said, you don't always need somebody, but when something happens, you want to be able to pick up the phone and know that you've got somebody on your side who can help you at least talk through the issues that you may be presented with. And the second thing I want to leave you with, these are two critical things, and I'm going to talk about this over and over, is know the Office of Church Staff Finances at the association. So the UUA, we have a group in our Ministries and Faith Development staff group called the Office of Church Staff Finances. And the Office of Church Staff Finances exists to provide information on employment and human resources for congregations. So they're a shop that can help you with your questions on compensation, benefits, staffing practices, policies, and it's a really thoughtful group of people, and they're well versed in their different expertises. And here's a link here. This is the web link on uua.org that you'll find them. And at the end of this presentation, I've got a couple of names and email addresses that I'll share with you as well for the different groups. But they can help you, as I said, with benefits, compensation, the different insurances that we offer, the UUA health plan, our term disability plan, our life insurance plan, the UUA retirement plan, and all of those things are important as you're thinking about putting together your human resources work at your congregation. So let's dive in. One of the basics that you want to gather is to make sure you have a well-organized personnel file. And so it goes into the personnel file. So you're going to keep all of the documents related to the recruitment of your employees. So for your staff, you want to keep their application forms. If they've submitted a resume or cover letter, copies of the interview notes, and any reference checks. Those will go into the personnel file. If you have a hire letter or contract for the employee, this could be an offer letter, a confirmation of hire, or sometimes there's a contract depending on the person. That will go into the personnel file. You don't want to have to be hunting for this stuff when something happens. You want to be able to access this easily if you need it. You're going to want to keep copies of the employee's job description in the personnel file. And as the job description gets updated over the course of time, you want to make sure that you put copies of the updates in the personnel file. And make sure you date them so you know which one has superseded the last. In terms of payroll data, you want to keep a copy of any rate change, any pay rate change that the employee experiences. So over the course of time, employees get raises, or they might go out on leave and their hours change and their pay rate will necessarily change. You want to keep documentation of the date and what the rate change was. Copies of any tax forms that the employee fills out. So the federal W-4, which is the form that the employee fills out, setting up how much they want deducted from their pay to go to for federal tax, and then any state tax forms that you may have to fill out. Certain states require special forms. Massachusetts has its own form, for example. There are other states that don't have forms. I'm trying to think of them. Texas, perhaps. Tennessee may not have a form. But you can find those online. And also keep in mind that certain cities require their own tax forms. So that if your employee works in a place like Philadelphia, they may need to fill out a tax form as well. And then any other deductions that you make from payroll, you want to keep a record of those in the personnel file. And these could be things like benefits deductions, or if the employee pays for parking through payroll, if you're taking out deductions for loans or anything like that, wage garnishments, those kind of things, you're going to want to make sure that you keep a record of that in the personnel file. I mentioned benefits, deductions. When you're enrolling your employees in benefits, the health insurance, the life insurance, LTD, any of the benefits, you should have them fill out an election form, and that will go into the personnel file, and you should keep that on record. And then any changes to the benefit elections, you should keep a record of that as well. So sometimes, let's say an employee starts with you on September 1st, they choose health insurance. So they sign up for a family health insurance plan. And then during open enrollment in November, they make a change and they drop that family health insurance. You're going to want to keep that change form showing that they dropped the health insurance, that there's a signature and a date on that form as well. Copies of any performance reviews that you have, or any warnings or performance related documentation, that should go into the personnel file too. Now, where do you keep the personnel files? My recommendation is that you have a locked and secured file cabinet. Perhaps you keep it in the congregational administrator's office or the minister's office. But it should be a place where you keep all of the documents. It should be locked and not accessible to random folks coming in and out of the office. And one of the things you're going to want to think about is who has access to the personnel file. And whether you have a personnel committee or a board, or whether the minister is the chief of staff, should consider who has access to the documents in the personnel file and when they may need to access them. Now part of the personnel, there's some information personnel file that you're going to want to keep separate from each employee's folder. So background checks. So when I'm setting up a personnel file, let's say I'm setting up Sharon's personnel file here. I've got her recruitment in there. I've got her benefits information. I've got her pay rate information in there. But we do background checks on all employees when they start at the association. I'm going to keep the background check separate from the personnel file because I don't want random managers and people to have access to that background check. So I'll keep it in the locked cabinet, but I'm going to keep it separate from Sharon's folder. So I might have one file just for employee background checks. The I-9 form, and I'll talk about I-9 forms in a little bit, but this is a document that the Citizenship and U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service requires all employers to keep. It has very specific information around relation to work in the United States and identity attached to this. You're going to want to keep those in a separate folder as well. Keep it in a locked cabinet, but keep it separate from, let's say, I'll keep Sharon's I-9 form separate from her personnel folder. Now the I-9 forms, well, I'll talk about those in a minute, so I won't get into depth on that yet. And then any medical forms, medical documentation, you want to keep separate because you don't want people to have access to an employee's specific medical information. So any information that you may be keeping around disability, reasonable accommodation requests under the ADA, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act, OSHA or workers' compensation accident reports, or FMLA requests. And I'll explain what these things are briefly. But any sort of medical documentation you don't want people to be able to access unless there's a specific and reasonable need to access them. So the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, requires employers to provide reasonable accommodations for job duties that the employee may have because they may have a disability. So let's say you have an employee that has a vision disability. So it may be a reasonable accommodation for that person would be providing them with a computer monitor that allows them to increase the size of the font so they can read it more easily. OSHA is the Occupational Safety and Health Administration of the federal government, and OSHA requires certain documentation for work-related injuries. So if an employee is injured in the course of their job, or if you're submitting those injury reports to your workers' compensation carrier, you're going to want to keep those in a separate place. And then any FMLA requests, Family and Medical Leave Act requests, these are for longer term periods of time off that the employee may use to take care of their own chronic health needs or needs of their family. And those will go into these medical files. So what else goes into the personnel file is the hire letter. And I think that every employee at time of hire should have a hire letter. You can do it as an offer letter. Sometimes when you make an offer to an employee to come work for your congregation, you can put together a letter that says, here's the position that we're offering you. What we do at the UUA, we negotiate the job employee, and then we put together what we call a confirmation of hire letter. Once the employee is accepted, we send the employee a letter saying, here's what we've agreed to, and we spell out this information in the hire letter. So they can, depending on the organization, they can differ a little bit, but here's what I like to see in a hire letter. First is a nice note of welcome. You want to congratulate your new employee on joining your congregation and make them feel like this is something because it is. They're coming to work for your congregation. You're going to want to document the title, their job title, who they report to, and what their start by date is. And notice that I use the language start by date rather than starting date. So you simply don't want to say your start date will be September 1st. I would use the language, we expect you to start by September 1st. And that gives you a little more leverage. Your employee, for some reason, doesn't show up on September 1st. And you can say, look, we expected you to start by this date. If there are significant problems, you may not want that employee actually to begin employment. You're going to document the pay, what their hourly or per pay period rate is. So for your non-exempt or hourly staff, you will quote their pay in an hourly rate. This will be making $15 an hour. And then you can annualize the amount. And you can say $15 an hour on an annualized basis comes out to this much per year. But I would always quote the rate by the hour or by pay period. For your salaried staff, your exempt staff, they're exempt from overtime, so we call them exempt staff. These are your salaried staff typically. You're going to quote pay in a per pay period amount. At the association, we pay staff twice a month, so I quote a semi-monthly pay rate. So your pay rate, your semi-monthly pay rate will be $1,000 per pay period, which comes out to $24,000 on an annualized basis. If you have a bi-weekly pay period, that's every 2 weeks rather than semi-monthly, twice a month, you can do the calculations on your own. I would list the person's schedule. You can document their schedule in the hire letter, which is basically how many hours per week are you expecting them to work, or how many hours per month. For certain employees, they may be working so many months per year, and I would include that documentation in the hire letter as well. You can outline the summary, a summary of benefits that the employee will get. It's always nice to go with your new employee, to include them in the hire letter. Oftentimes that conversation hasn't happened in depth during the interview process, so make sure your employee knows what benefits you're offering. And then in the hire letter, I would include language that says benefits are subject to change at any time, because you don't know what may happen a year or 2 or 5 years out. It may be that you need to change the benefits, or the benefits change in some way, and that you want to, you don't ever want to promise a certain set of benefits that they will be in place for the entire length of employment that employee will be with you. Certain states are at-will employers. Massachusetts, where the UUA is headquartered, is an at-will state. And what this means is that that employees can terminate their employment at any time for any reason, and the employer reserves the right to terminate employment at any time for any reason that isn't discriminatory. So this just makes it clear upfront that should you ever have a layoff, or you need to furlough people, that that you exercise the right to do that. Or if the employee isn't meeting expectations, or is exhibiting violence, or making threats, or is engaged in misconduct, perhaps they're stealing, you want to be able to terminate employment right away. You don't want any statement in your letter or in your employee handbook that says that you promise a certain amount of notice, that you'll promise 2 weeks notice before you'll let that employee go. Some states are not at-will employers, so you'll want to check with your labor attorney to make sure you know whether you're an at-will state or not. I always put in the hire letter that we require I-9 documentation at time of hire. So on the first day, we will collect the I-9 documentation. And as I said, I'll talk about the I-9 in a minute. And you cannot specify which pieces of I-9 documentation the employee can bring with them or can provide. There's a long list that the Citizenship and Naturalization Services, the USCIS, permits. I've seen some employers say, please bring with you a passport or your driver's license and social security. You can suggest that, but you can't require those documents. There are other ones that the employee may be able to provide that serve as well. And then any orientation details that that may be important. This is when you should to start and where to go and who to ask for. You'd be surprised at how often that little detail goes unsaid. And on the first day, the employee is wandering around your congregation looking for the person they're supposed to be meeting or where they're supposed to be going, and they don't know what time they're supposed to show up. So they may show up at 7 o'clock in the morning or 8 o'clock in the morning and be there to greet them. So provide some orientation details of who they should meet and when they should show up and where to go. And I always make it a practice to ask the to sign the copy of their hire letter, and that goes into the personnel file as well, so that all of that is documented and saved. Now, I've mentioned the Form I-9 several times, and this is required by our U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. This is the Department of Homeland Security, and it's required for all employers, even churches, to do. It is the purpose of this is to prove the employee's eligibility to work in the United States, and it proves their identity as well. And there's a list of documents on the back of this form, and you'll see that I've got a link, www.uscis.gov/I-9Central. And there's all the information you need about finding the I-9 form, how to look for the, how to ask for the right documentation the employee can provide that serves for this, how to fill out the form, and you're going to want to make sure these forms are filled out very carefully, and again, kept in the personnel file. Now, there's always a question of whether you photocopy the employee's IDs and keep them or not. And you can do either or. You can photocopy the IDs that the employee provides, or you don't have to. But I would choose one system and stick with it. Either choose to photocopy every employee's IDs and keep those photocopies with the I-9, or don't photocopy any employee's IDs and don't keep any of them with the I-9s. Just keep the I-9 paperwork itself. Do one or the other. And as I said, you keep these secured and separate in the personnel file. Now, there's a part of this form that needs to be completed on the employee's first day of employment. And then the rest of the form has to be completed by the employee's third day of employment. You cannot keep the employee on if the form is not complete and the documentation, and the employee does not provide appropriate documentation. So you cannot keep the employee on your past the third day if they haven't completed this documentation appropriately. And there's a place for the employer to sign a date and make sure that they filled out all of the documentation numbers, ID numbers, and things like that as well. And my question to you is, are you using the latest version of the I-9 form? So Homeland Security updates this periodically. So oftentimes what happens is you download a copy and then a year later Homeland Security has updated the form. You always want to be using the most updated form. If you go on to I-9 Central the website that I've listed here, you can download the most up-to-date form. And I believe right now that the last update was done in October of 2019. So you shouldn't have that form. And they're always updating the documentation requirements as well. This document will serve, this one will not serve. So pay special attention to that. Now, job descriptions. Jobs you're going to want to keep in the personnel file too, and job descriptions are really critical. They form the basis of so much work that we do in human resources. They're really prime for your personnel related work in the congregation. Now, why is job description so important? First of all, it forms the basis of your recruiting efforts. So when you're starting to recruit, when you're thinking about hiring your new employees, you put together the job description, and part of the job description should be about putting together base job qualifications so you know how to screen appropriately for those job candidates who are applying for your jobs. So when I'm recruiting, I get my pile of resumes that come in, and how do I know which resumes to put in the yes, I want to interview this person pile, or no, I don't want to interview this person? Because you've done a good job description and you've outlined the basic qualifications for the position. And that will help you make those decisions when you're looking at resumes. Interview this person, don't interview this one. It also helps you develop interview questions you can assess competencies. So you put together your job description and you have a whole list of duties that the person will be performing. So what competencies do they need? Do they need computer skills? Do they need systems analysis skills? Do they need to understand um, um, adult education if they're a religious educator? Do they need to understand childhood educational development? All of those competencies that you're going to identify in the job description will help you develop appropriate review questions at the time you're ready to start your search. Your job description will also help you if an employee has a disability and they ask for a reasonable accommodation request. You're going to have a section of your job, go through the parts of the job description in a second, but you're going to the essential functions of the job. These are the important duties that your employee will be performing. So the essential functions are the things that the employee must perform in their, they're not the nice to haves. So let's say you've got your administrator will enter um, um, membership data into the database. They're going to put together the order of service. They're going to do 6 or 7 other really important things. But you might have a staff party at year end to celebrate the holidays. I would say that this putting together the staff party probably isn't an essential function of the job. It could be done by other, but putting in the membership data into the database, putting together the weekly order of service, those are essential functions of the congregational administration. And so let's say the congregational administrator comes to you as, I've got a disability and I'm having trouble accomplishing these tasks. You're going to enter into a dialogue with that person about what sort of accommodations they would need that would permit them um, to perform those essential functions. And so having this documented, having the essential functions documented in advance is going to be critical, because you don't want to have to be putting together the job description when this conversation happens. If your employee is injured and needs to go out on disability, or if have some sort of medical issue and they need to go out on long-term disability, you're going to need the job description to give to the insurance carrier as part of that insurance claim. So have your job description ready for that in advance. Oftentimes these things are really time sensitive. Your employee's injured or they're ill seriously ill, they're going out on long-term disability. You need that claim processed quickly by the insurance carrier. You don't want to be spending days or a week or two putting together a job description to send to the carrier. You want that ready at the right time. And then the job description is so critically important as you focus on and assess the employee's performance. So as you're talking about professional development for the employee, as you're talking about performance management and doing performance reviews, the job description is the centerpiece of how you assess performance for that employee. What are you basing the employee's performance on? The job description. Are they doing the duties that ask them? Are they completing their, are they meeting their goals, finishing their projects and the essential functions of their job well? And if you have that documented in the job description, that's a really good starting place. You don't want to be making this up on the fly. And the job description is going to be helpful for you as you decide whether this employee is exempt from the overtime laws. Um, Depending on the person's job, they may be paid by the hour. They may be a non-exempt employee. So typically your sextons or your custodians um, may not meet the exemption requirements by the Department of Labor, and you may have to pay the hour and pay them overtime for hours that they're beyond 40 hours a week. And in certain states, you need to pay overtime beyond 8 hours a day. So for California, for example, if you have non-exempt employees in California, you need to pay overtime over 8 hours a day. So the job description is going to help you make those decisions. Is the person exempt from overtime or not? And it's also going to help you do your research around compensation and how much you should be paying the employee, or setting the compensation range at time of hire or raises over the course of time. And I'll talk a little bit about compensation in a bit. Now, what goes into the description? I've talked about why it's so important, but these are the things that I would include in anyone's job description. You're going to document their title, how many hours per week they're able to work, or what their schedule is, the salary range, if you figured that out, and the exemption. Are they exempt from overtime or not? This is an position, or this is a non-exempt position. You'd state purpose in a couple sentences. What is the purpose of the job? How does this job serve the mission of your congregation? Why does this job exist? Is this job important? State that in a couple of sentences, and that's really helpful to help focus your employee on how they serve the mission of your congregation. I talked about essential functions. These are the duties that your employee is expected to perform. These are the 5, 10, 15 things that must be performed by your employee. And I would estimate, you can estimate how much time may be on these. Some employees don't need time estimates, but for other employees, it may be helpful to put in, this is 20% of your time spent on this, 30% of your time spent on this, half of your time is spent on this other thing. You don't document every single thing that the employee does. You don't need a 10-page job description, but what are the most important things that the employee is expected to do in their job? I would document any reporting relationships. To whom we report, what position does this employee report to, and does this employee have any supervisory responsibilities? I wouldn't name names, but what I would do is list the positions. So this position reports to the senior minister, or this position supervises the congregational administrator and the sexton. And that's how I would list reporting relationships and supervisory responsibilities. I would document in the job description the minimum requirements to meet this position. So this is helpful for your job search. So what educational requirements would you consider a minimum for this job? What experience would you consider a minimum? How many years of experience? What kind of experience would you require? What skills do you require for the person to enter into this position? And what certifications might they need? Do you need a minister, UU minister in full fellowship, for example? Do you need computer skills? What kind of computer skills do you need? And I would document those here as well. And you're talking about minimum requirements, not the nice to haves. And you can say that. You could say it would be helpful to have, or it would be nice to have these other things. But I would first document the specific basics that the person must have in order to meet, in order to apply for this job. Are there any, I would document working conditions and any physical or mental requirements that are necessary. Person have to work outside at all? Are they working in an office environment? Do they have to lift boxes up to a certain weight? Do they have to move equipment around? So perhaps your custodian has to move and lift vacuum cleaners. So may have to move and lift in up to 25 pounds. Or your congregational administrator might have to put boxes of files together, may have to lift and move file boxes up to 25 pounds, for example. And then there's always the line that I like to add at the bottom of the job description, which is performs additional duties as assigned. And this serves a couple of purposes. One is you don't always get everything in the job description. Over the course of time, will shift a little bit. And this allows you to take care of those things that you may be, that the employee may be working on over the course of time that haven't been documented initially in the job description. This also helps with every once in a while, you'll have an employee say, wait a minute, that's not in my job description. And they push back really hard on your supervision. So this is a way of saying, look, I need you to do these other things, and I'm asking you to do these things because I can. We need you to do them, and I have the right and responsibility to be able to do that by asking you to take those responsibilities on. And I want to lift up here too, that in terms of equity, this performs additional duties as assigned isn't a free-for-all pass, isn't a free pass to let you dump work on staff who already may be overburdened with other responsibilities. So use this performs duties with care. I've got a link here for you. It's on our Leader Lab pages. It's again, it's put up and curated by our Office of Church Staff Finances. And there's great documentation here about how to put together a job description and that may be helpful for you. There's sample copies of job descriptions and templates that you may be able to use. And this page on the web will help you dig deeply into these different parts of what will go into a thoughtful job description. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot talking about recruiting, but I do want to talk about staffing for diversity and how we might think about a diverse workforce in our congregations. And this is important for us. I know that the majority of our staff and our congregations identify as white people. And as we talk about diversifying our staff and diversity in our congregations, I think it's really important to take a step back and think about why we're doing what we do and having a thoughtful process, or just saying, I'm going to hire a person of color because we need a person of color on our team. I think it's important to have some thoughtful discussions with the folks who are working on personnel in your congregation. So my first recommendation is slow the process down as much as possible. So oftentimes what happens is, and I see this quite frequently, is you have an opening and there's a natural reaction. We've lost an employee. We have to fill that position right away because, oh my gosh, how are we going to get all the work done that this employee was doing? And there's a rush to advertise, there's a rush to hire. So when you're staffing for diversity, when you're thinking about creating a diverse staff, you need to slow the process down because oftentimes in our rush to do things, we're skipping over really well-qualified people who bring diverse perspectives or diversity in terms of racial ethnic mixes or diversity in terms of ability or disability, neurodiversity to our staff. We different critical thinking styles, all of those things we might tend to overlook if we're rushing to hire. So slow this down, take your time. The second thing I would suggest to you, commitment to diversity comes from leadership. And if your leadership isn't having these conversations, you should be, and you should be having them before you start hiring new staff. And then this one I think is critically important and it's really complex. I'm asking you the question, have you done your homework first? And before you start thinking about staffing for diversity, I want you to start thinking about what inclusion looks like in your congregation and what equity looks like in your congregation. Have you spent time thinking about what the experience is for people who have different identities in your congregation? And I would spend some time doing that before spending some time thinking about how you're necessarily going to hire for a diverse group of employees. And then consider how you're approaching your search process. The first is creating a search team. If your search team isn't diverse in racial and ethnic diversity, isn't diverse of ability, isn't diverse in terms of LGBTQ people, isn't diverse in terms of neurodiversity, it's harder to hire for diversity because you're not getting you're not you're not getting different viewpoints into your candidates. Consider worked and lived experience rather than just those minimum qualifications. So when you put together the job description, oftentimes we one of our natural places to set basic qualifications, excuse me, is around education. We're going to require a bachelor's degree. That's oftentimes the first thing that we think about. And that leaves out a whole set of our population who may be qualified for your job and who may be able to do the job well. So you might consider a line in your job description that says, we welcome worked and lived experience in place of the minimum requirement for education and experience that we've listed, because you may find people who have really significant and important contributions that they can bring to your staff who don't necessarily have a degree or 10 years of experience in that specific role. I would suggest to you that more than that of eyes review every resume. So this is another way to avoid bias in the search process. Oftentimes what happens is if you have one person flipping through the resumes, they're bringing all of their own unconscious biases to the search process. And so if you have more than one person reviewing resumes and saying, hey, how come we didn't include this person? It's another way of helping to develop a diverse pool. And one of your goals is up a diverse pool of candidates. There's been a lot of research done that shows that if you have the more diverse your pool of candidates is, the more likely you are to hire a candidate from a historically marginalized community. And the numbers are remarkable in terms of this research. So let's say you have 4 people in your finalist round, and one of those people is a person of color, and the other 3 are people. The chances of hiring, the research shows that the chances of hiring that person of color are almost 0. If you increase that percentage to 50%, if you have 2 people of color in your finalist round and 2 white people, the chances of hiring a person of color rise to 50%. So this is my research shows that this is important for different identity groups as well. So the more diverse your candidate pool is, especially as you get into the final round, the chances of hiring for diversity, a successful diversity hire, increase significantly.
Rob, I was thinking about two
Sure.
things about this. One was the slowing down. I remember one time we did a hiring process in the region and the candidate pool was so similar, we did not hire. We actually waited and then we had a conversation about where else do we need to advertise because this is not the pool we wanted. So this was months more of work, but it was because of a kind of commitment we had in our head about this. And then the other thing I just wanted to talk about that I think I've been on teams that didn't think this through enough and there was pain later on, is people thought, well, great, oh good, we've got someone new with a certain difference from the rest of us. And
Mm-hmm.
they, honestly, I feel like that's how the team members looked at it instead of the whole culture is going to have to shift because we've added a new person. I mean, the culture always shifts when you add a new person, but when you're also adding someone from a historically marginalized identity or who might be someone who has the only person with this ethnic background in your
Mm-hmm.
congregation, your team that they're on is going to have to learn some new things in order for everyone to function well. And some teams don't even think about that. And then there's more pain often for the person who was hired as time goes on.
I think you're exactly right. I think those are both really important considerations. So slowing the process down, and sometimes you just have to take a step back and say, or move backwards and say, wait a minute, our pool is not diverse enough. We shouldn't move forward into a next round of interviews. We need to broaden our networks. We need to work our networks. We need to think about um, how we can find more candidates who may be appropriate for the position. And then I think you're absolutely right too about, and this would, I would say this falls doing your homework. Are you having the conversations around workplace culture and inclusion and what this means when you're bringing in people who bring different values, who bring different approaches, who bring different work styles, who bring different life experience with, and what that may mean for the culture of your existing work group. Because you're right, the culture always changes whenever you add anybody new to staff. And so it's something to be really thoughtful about. And the goal isn't to make that new person, um, to mold that new person into the existing culture. It's to expand and find new ways of operating as a whole and create something new when that new person joins you. I think that's something that we oftentimes, we just don't think about that. And it needs to be very thoughtful and intentional. Um, so do your homework and spend some time thinking about this. And this is where I find that my recommendation here is reach out to your congregational life staff. This is where folks like Sharon um, can really support the work of the congregation in helping think through some of these things as you're approaching these issues in your congregation and with your staff. One of the things I know about HR is that HR isn't about hiring. It isn't about job descriptions. It isn't about um, performance reviews. All of those things are there, but HR is about culture and culture change and supporting the mission of the organization. So what are our values and how are we living out those values in our search processes and in our staff teams? So I think, Sharon, those are really important points that you brought up. How are we supporting the culture that we want to create?
Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Rob. And your canine friends have been very patient with us. I'm sure they're awaiting dinner or entertainment from you or something. So
They're definitely waiting entertainment from me, and I apologize for the dry throat, and
that's
and I'm
like, that's
really
fine.
grateful for this time with you and the folks in the Mid-America region, and to share some of my HR work with you all.
Thank you for sharing yourself with us, and be good out there. Bye-bye.